So hi everybody that's joining. We're just going to give a moment or two for people to arrive before we get rolling. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome, Heidi. We're just letting people into the room.
Great. Sorry, I was caught up in another meeting, obviously. Isn't that
Glad you're here. Very glad you're here.
You'd think we wouldn't be late to meetings anymore, but somehow I'm more often late to meetings now.
Right.
It feels that way.
Yeah.
All right, so it's 2 minutes after the hour. Let's go ahead and get started, everyone. So I'm James Brown, Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our presentation on the state of STEM education during COVID-19 and back to school plans. We've assembled a panel here that represents classroom teachers, school leaders, researchers, people who work in the industry that's supporting hands-on science learning. And we hope to give you a bunch of different perspectives and hopefully some good takeaways as to what we know about the current state of STEM education during the pandemic and where we expect to go from here. So at this point, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Anderson, who is the Science Education Consultant to Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, also is the President of the Council of State Science Supervisors. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, James. I appreciate being able to share some thoughts here today. I'm going to share my screen with a couple thoughts on it to guide my thinking, I think, more than anything as we go through here today. And starting this conversation today, honestly, the first thing that I really wanted to do, thinking big picture STEM and the craziness that is COVID and education and all we're doing right now, I want to take a minute to acknowledge educators' efforts and then build on that to talk a little bit about some of the issues and big issues that we're dealing with right now in education that I see in Wisconsin and that the Council of State Science Supervisors members are seeing across the country. So first, to celebrate what's going on in the difficult challenge that educators have faced, we've seen amazing work in Wisconsin. So to start with, in science in this STEM world, school systems have done great work to provide students access to learning. We've got school districts in Wisconsin that have provided, for example, Chromebooks and hotspots to every student, sometimes even hand delivering those to students' homes. And then in classrooms in science, students are then able to do things like I saw with one teacher, where students, even at the elementary age, are collaborating in Google Draw to draw pictures of weather systems and compare ideas and talk about what they're seeing and doing. In technology, I've seen systems that support teacher learning in this area, particularly building on Computer Science Week, which has been a big thing in Wisconsin. And I do want to note that by technology, I mean the creation of technology, not necessarily the use of it. But there are many classrooms where teachers I've talked to are using programs like virtual robotics or computer science programming such as Scratch to get kids engaged in that technology part of the STEM. In the engineering world, we have districts providing take-home kits to students, where when they provide free lunches, kids can also pick up a kit of materials if they don't have materials necessarily available at home. And again, we've got educators out hand delivering some materials, so students have what they need. And then I just heard a story last week of a Milwaukee educator who had students at the kindergarten level sharing through Flipgrid, which is you take like a personal video of yourself and you share it with your class on Flipgrid. So we had kindergartners sharing their engineering learning with videos of them on Flipgrid in a Milwaukee school, which I thought was amazing. And thinking of mathematics, we had one school system really emphasizing equity, where they decided to use conference calls instead of Zoom or other platforms. and where teachers then use conference calls in combination with packets to give one-on-one support to students where they don't have access to all the technology or internet that they might need. And so they're just amazing examples of teachers doing the best they can and using a variety of tools within their systems to get stuff done. But there's certainly big picture challenges that we continue to hear about across states, across systems in Wisconsin. And of course, number one would be high-speed internet. Not going away, that we've got rural districts in Wisconsin where 50–60% of the kids don't have high-speed internet, don't have quality cell service. So giving them Chromebooks, giving them hotspots isn't going to do any good. We have ongoing issues around professional learning. So there's been amazing inroads in helping teachers understand virtual environments, in engaging students in STEM topics in these areas, but there's still a lot of work to go. And there's a lot of work to go for those school systems that are going back to school to some extent as well, because doing kind of the hands-on type work that happens in STEM and science classrooms takes a certain mind to safety, and getting students to do that in this environment that teachers haven't had to deal with before. And on that note of professional learning, I think something that can't be forgotten is that teachers need support in figuring out how to support students' social and emotional needs as well. And that's been a big emphasis in Wisconsin, that we want that to be in the forefront, but teachers in virtual and hybrid and stressed environments don't always know how and where to go for that. And often the not knowing where to go is because there's currently just a lack of capacity to provide this kind of learning for educators. At not having done it before, there isn't this huge sudden influx of experts that have the virtual teaching and learning expertise in the STEM world to fill the need. So we're having to grow the trainers from not a whole lot of a huge cadre of trainers right now to grow that capacity so that the professional learning can actually be provided where it's needed. And even where we have teachers doing amazing things, even if we have some capacity for the professional learning, we don't necessarily have quality tools and curriculum materials yet for teachers to use and access in their classrooms. The online platforms are honestly still a bit clunky. Curriculum materials for STEM and science, some that are good are behind paywalls that districts can't afford, and some that are free are in a more beta draft stage that they're not quite there yet at the quality that we want them to be for all these online resources that teachers might use. And finally, a constant refrain that I hear across the country is that priorities in districts and systems in the spring and moving now into the fall has been to narrow what they teach to often core subjects of mathematics and reading. And so students don't, especially in some areas of Wisconsin, I would say, students don't necessarily get access to STEM and science learning that we would want. So because those priorities are on subjects other than STEM and science, sometimes we just don't get the learning and the identity building that we need to build up professionals in those STEM subjects. And with that, I'll turn it over to our next presenter. Thanks, James.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So next up, we have Heidi Schweingruber, Director of the Board of Science, the Board on Science Education, the National Academies. That was a mouthful. Thank you, Heidi.
My name alone is a mouthful. Thanks so much. I'm glad to join this great panel. I'm going to give sort of in two parts, an overview of a report that we released July 15th that takes up the questions of reopening more generally as sort of a context for then thinking about STEM education specifically. We'll see how much I get to put on the table in my this first 5 minutes, and maybe if I don't get to all of it, I can mention it, some of it in the discussion. So we did a report looking at the reopening at sort of breakneck speed for the academies, but we did it because we knew there was a lot of urgency around it. It takes up mainly the health-related issues around the decision to reopen school buildings, And then also how, if you do reopen buildings, how to mitigate spread. So it doesn't take up all the education and learning and teaching questions that we need to sort of dig into on this panel, but it sets a stage for thinking about what's this essential tension. How are we grappling with these questions? The committee that did this study kind of recognized that fundamentally, this question of reopening buildings and having in-person instruction versus remaining in a virtual or distance space is really about weighing health risks and educational risks. That it's really a risk analysis in a sense. It's the health risks for students, staff, families, the broader community. If you open up schools fully, we know that children are at lower risk of getting COVID-19 and have less serious consequences. However, we don't know their role in transmission fully. So we don't know, and we do know that the adults in the building are vulnerable. And so you have multiple layers to understanding the health risk and whether kids with adults in that school are then gonna go take the virus to their families and to the community. You need to weigh those health risks against the educational risks. And the consideration here, the committee really emphasized, isn't school or no school, isn't education or no education. Schools are educating kids, even in the spring when it was really hard. They, as Kevin pointed out, they went to yeoman's efforts to really make sure that they were reaching students. It's really, the comparison is distance and virtual learning and in-person learning. So we need to be very clear on that. And so the committee really looked at which kids might be more at risk from virtual or distance learning alone if you're keeping buildings closed. So they came down on the younger kids, because of the kind of support they need to thrive really in distance and virtual learning settings, are probably more at risk, and kids with special needs who need that in-person experience. So they emphasized everybody does better when there's in-person learning. So weighing the public health risks, if you can reopen, try to reopen, especially for the younger kids, but you have to put in place the measures in the school that are gonna keep everybody safe and keep the adults safe. Now, what this means though is that every school system is likely to be engaging in some form of blended learning. You're likely going to use virtual distance in some way because you're going to have some high-risk kids who might need it. You're going to have some teachers who might be high-risk themselves and need the option of being virtual to their students. So we're probably looking at blended learning for at least some kids, no matter what. And in some cases, we're going to be looking at all virtual or distance learning. So when we're thinking about how to do STEM in the environment in the coming year, we have to assume we're going to need plans that take that into account, and that we're probably planning for maybe some in-person, but always planning for some distance or blended, which is a challenge and lays an extra burden on educators. The committee also stressed that if you want in-person instruction, you must implement mitigation measures that limit transmission of the virus. Now, how much you have to do that is going to vary with the level of community spread, but you have to do it. We have to protect the adults in the school and the adult family members. I'm not going to go into the details about those mitigation strategies because they're not as STEM specific, but we know that we have to do it. So some more specific, what are the implications for STEM education? We didn't go into this in that reopening report, and I'm happy to talk about that reopening report in more detail in discussion. But we are in the process of putting together an additional document that Carnegie Corporation has funded to give some guidance on teaching science during the coming school year, given that we know there's this blend or whatever. And many of the things that we're thinking about there also apply to STEM more broadly. But before I get to that, I want to talk about, in thinking about STEM education, one of the things we have to do, I think, is consider some of our pre-existing conditions in STEM education and think how the pandemic might actually be exacerbating them. Many of what we're talking about in the context of COVID isn't new. They're problems we knew we had. They're just being made worse by the challenges of the pandemic. So I'll call out one that's particularly important to me, and I think also Renee. We know there's too little time for science in elementary. And with the concerns about spring learning loss, and I could have a whole other discussion about the frames around learning loss, but let's not go there. But we run a risk, as Kevin alluded to, of pushing out time for science, especially in elementary, because people seem to think, you know, we got to get them reading, so let's just focus on that. We already have a situation where we don't do enough science in elementary, and this could be exacerbated by the pandemic. We also know that we're still in the process of implementation of new instructional approaches that are research-based, that aren't your traditional sort of read or memorize or regurgitate. That's in science and in math. And we're still in a process of getting teachers, even in in-person settings, to fully embrace and implement this approach, and to have curricula that support that approach, and get administrators who understand that approach. We're now in a situation where we're going to blended, where there's some surveys of teachers in the spring that show they're already reporting that they pulled back on some of those more innovative and what we know are more effective approaches to instruction. So we could have in the coming year people pulling back on this sort of implementation that they'd already been trying. We know we have existing inequities in schooling. We know we have big problems here, systemic and at every level, state, district, school, classroom. There are inequities in every slice. Especially have problems for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students and low-income students. In general, some specific issues in STEM, particularly for these kids. Sort of trends in not having the same access to high quality learning experiences in STEM for various reasons at various levels. Again, the pandemic is exacerbating that, right? And I have serious concerns that the focus on learning loss and the assumptions about who is having the most loss might lead to a remediation approach for those same kids who we know already don't have access to the highest quality learning experiences in STEM. We've really got to think that through when we're moving to responding to the pandemic. And finally, Kevin alluded to this, the existing digital divide. So we really had that full in our face during the spring 2020 closures. And as Kevin pointed out, there was a massive effort to ameliorate that. And there's probably going to be better in the coming year because schools have done a lot and they're planning around it, but we're not going to solve it completely. For example, about 26% of people in rural areas and 32% of people living on tribal lands lack access to reliable broadband. Who cares if you give them a device if they don't have access to broadband, right? That's compared to 2% of people in urban areas. Similarly, about 26% of low-income families do not have internet access, this is anywhere, and only have access through a smartphone. So again, that's where providing devices helped for some communities, but maybe it didn't help for all. Now, I have a few things that are some things we need to prioritize to address this, but I want to check my time, James, and see if I should stop there or if I should go through them.
So why don't we save a little bit more time for questions at the end, because I know we're going to have some. So any concluding remarks, Heidi?
I would say, so we need to keep in mind all of those preconditions as we plan for the future. I would say just a couple things. One is, especially when we're in situations where we're largely virtual or distance, we really need to think about the relationship part of education with students, teachers, and families. It might be harder to do when you're at a distance, but how to do it, how to think about families, communities as having assets you can leverage for education, since now part of the environment is going to be home and community. And when you're designing instruction, think about leveraging the assets of each kind of setting. And finally, we need to provide, and this really dovetails with Kevin, time, resources, and the social connections for teachers to do this, right? This is a new thing we're asking. Since we're probably asking them to consider in-person and virtual, it's an even bigger burden than they already have. So we really have to keep that in mind and provide them with support. And that's it.
Thank you so much. So next up, we have Renee Pullen, who's Elementary Science Curriculum Instructional Specialist with Cato Parish Schools in Shreveport, Louisiana. Renee, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm going to start sharing my screen and I will cut off my video for bandwidth purposes. Okay, so thank you for having me. Good afternoon. I am Renee Pullen from Shreveport in North Louisiana. I service about 38 elementary schools that are located in urban suburban, and also very rural areas. So I want to share with you some challenges we faced, then talk about the main needs we have right now. So when school shut down in March, we had to scramble to get things in place. We were, the teachers were really inundated with tools and suggestions, and it all ended up being very, very overwhelming for them. And they were anxious and scared and underprepared for a reality that we were not prepared for. We didn't even know was going to be a possibility. And so at first we tried to do brick and mortar school virtually, which was, it didn't work out. that was a pass. So we had to regroup. And then we changed our approach to fit our needs. We started to have a better plan and a better trajectory of learning online. And so here's an example. I had one teacher, and she's one of my veteran teachers, like she's got 30 years in the game. And during quarantine, she called me and she said, Pullen, I want my kids to talk and type on the Google at the same time. So I want you to show me how to do that, and I don't want to look at a video. So we got on the Zoom. I showed her how to use the Google and the Google Slides collaboratively. And so she was able to work with her students online, virtual, have that opportunity. And later she gave me a slide deck of the kids with their pictures. Some had pictures, some had text where they just wrote in about them sliding things around their home, looking at force and motion. And so having this opportunity for the students to engage, collaborate in a virtual space from a teacher who typically, when we say, we need you to go to file and download this, the first thing she asks every time is, okay, so where's file? So this is a teacher who didn't think she could do tech. And because we're forced in this situation, she had an opportunity to change her mind about how she interacts with those things. So while COVID exposed a bunch of inequities for students and for teachers, because as we think about our students not having access, we had a lot of teachers we discovered, they also only had access to internet via their phone. So it exposed a lot of things between within our district that we needed to really think about critically, but it also exposed a lot of opportunities. So a lot of things have transpired since March, and we still have a bunch of needs, a ton. And so I want to share some needs from a teacher perspective. And when I first wrote my list, I was like, okay, so I'll be talking for 20 minutes. And so I've dwindled it down to just the 5 biggest things that my teachers and I, that we need to make sure that we have a great year next year. And so the first thing is we need to know that our school community, that we're safe, that the students are safe, the teachers are safe. We had a Zoom with community leaders, including some pediatricians. And one of the things they said was that something that we really hadn't considered is we think a lot about what happens between the child and the teacher, but what's really important to think about is the adult space, what's happening there, and how are we safe in those spaces. And the truth of the matter is a lot of teachers they're not convinced we're going back to a safe working environment. So that's something that we need to think about and prepare for. Consistent messaging. We know that we have to be flexible and things are going to change based off of where we are, but the rumor mill in a community can be brutal. So having clear, concise, transparent messaging can help with that. Another thing that we need is professional learning, social emotional learning, using those online tools. We decided that we learned from the spring that we have to do less tools, because when we tried to give them too many, they ended up having trouble doing anything. And so just being really thoughtful with our professional learning plan throughout the year and giving teachers time to collaborate. That's going to be very important. Equitable practices, just like Kevin and Heidi talked about, we can give students devices, but that doesn't necessarily mean they still have dependable internet access. They can even have access to the internet and still don't have the right access so that they can do things like Zoom or do a Flipgrid or collaborate with one another. And so the last thing that I want us to talk about that we need grace and reassurance. It is scary, and we are, the tide is turning right now when it comes to the climate of where teachers are entering into, and the things that are being said about public education and what's happening with students entering into whether it is virtual or hybrid. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? It's just an uncertain time. And so we all need just some grace and reassurance as we grapple with the things that are ahead. So that's what I wanted to share with you, our perspective, where we are, and it's a challenge. And teachers don't feel like they have a lot of control over their situation. And the last thing I want to say before we go is we had to make a tough decision that when it came to for STEM, for all of our STEM subjects, if students are engaging with materials that they share, we can't do that. We have to rethink how we have them engage. That's hard for a teacher. It goes against what we believe, what we value. And so we have safety issues, but we have pedagogical issues we're grappling with. And sometimes I feel like there's so much going on, we don't get to talk about that. And so that's what I wanted to share with you guys today.
Thank you so much. So next up, we have Kirsten Ellenbogen, who is president and CEO of the Great Lakes Science Center in Cleveland, Ohio.
Thanks for having me here today. So I'm going to talk about three big topics. I want to set the stage for those of you who are not deeply working already with science centers and other museums in your community, with that out of school time group that they collaborate with. I want to set the stage with that. I'm going to talk about the role that our organizations have been playing during the pandemic. And then the third thing is steps to move forward. And let me start by referencing something that Heidi talked about, right? She talked about these preconditions we really need to be aware of when we look at how we're best going to support schools. And Renee really elaborated on those in a compelling way. I want to propose some positive preconditions that exist in the community in talking about the work of science centers, children's museums, the whole range of museums in our community, the out-of-school time work, and the existence of something called STEM ecosystems. And I want to make sure you're all familiar with that. Because as John Dewey was very good about always saying, education is neither a privilege or a responsibility. Education's neither, can't believe I'm going to misquote John Dewey. Education is neither a responsibility nor a practice that is limited to schools. So in these urgent times of need, let's make sure we're stepping back and looking at that broader ecosystem that is already supporting education. Science centers in particular, but certainly when you look broadly across the kinds of organizations I'm talking about, we are already working very closely with three key audiences. We're working with families, we're working with schools, and we're working with scientists. That puts us in a very important position during the pandemic. Science centers and many other kinds of museums that work with us, we're doing both science education and science communication. That education and communication balance is a key piece as we work through the pandemic. And the integration with schools, there are so many districts where you can go through and see a strong integration already. I'll use Cleveland as an example for a moment. We have a very progressive, thoughtful, large system here in Cleveland, the Cleveland Metro School District. They have strict requirements on collaboration with external organizations. They do not allow the typical, visit and run field trips. And so we work in advance with the curriculum developers across the district and get pre-approval on comprehensive grade-wide programming that we're doing. That's evolved over the recent years so that we're now doing that kind of comprehensive programming that includes 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, key developmental years for STEM workforce. And by the time you get to the 8th grade level, where we're working on data, coding, Internet of Things, really taking, Cleveland's doing a lot of work around blockchain, around really thinking about emerging technologies. We're doing 4 intensive days with those youth. That means we're already deeply embedded with our district. So as the district is shifting and going through a model first of considering a mixed hybrid approach to the school year, and now moving that into a fully virtual. We are already, every single 6th, 7th, and 8th grade teacher is already used to working with us. So now we shift into, okay, if this is the structure that your school year is going to be in, and here are your urgent needs, how do we make sure we're providing for you? So looking for those organizations out in the communities, you can call them boundary spanners, is a very powerful way to think about it. There are already organizations that are positioned to help schools or already helping schools. They may be a sleeping giant in your community that needs to be awoken, but you need to pull them in. And that's broad. I mean, I'm giving some very specific examples, but the outreach, you know, we're out in Cleveland recreation centers, the teacher professional development, and then really thinking about that ecosystem collaboration. If you're not familiar with STEM ecosystems in your area, I urge you to go to stemecosystems.org. You will find there, you know, detail on the 89 ecosystems that are in existence in the United States, the 1,200 out-of-school and informal learning partners that are already working in those ecosystems, and the 33 million children that are already being served through those ecosystems. So if you are not coordinating with those groups already, and there are quite a few of them already hard at work mapping out the resources in the community, certainly here in Northeast Ohio, our primary activity is to say, we've got to really step back, map again our resources in the ecosystem, and mobilize in a coordinated way so that we don't get these bits and pieces coming in to support schools. I want to leave you with a few reminders about the roles that we can play and how we move forward. Remember that a lot of these organizations can support schools where schools need things most. A lot of science centers and museums, they're in new buildings where we have HVAC systems and hand washing facilities and things, you know, my husband's a public school teacher. I can give you a list of the buildings that he hasn't been able to drink water in or even use the bathrooms in some of them, right? We're talking about basic facility needs here. Sometimes your best option is going to be to spread out, simply looking at square footage. The other thing to remember, science centers, we blow things up every day at our organization. You know, we have regular inspections on safety. If you want anybody in your community who knows how to thread the needle on keeping people safe while you do educational activities, we do that every day, right? And you're going to look around the community and find those resources are very well positioned to be there with schools side by side to make sure education happens during the pandemic. I do want to remind also, as another thing as we're looking forward, in addition to mapping those resources, we've already heard about our youth who are at greatest risk. Remember that the slide ruler for who's at greatest risk, right? That's going to be shifting right now. We are going to see more and more families at great risk. And so making sure we're picking up more families as we go. That'll only come to make sure that there's full integration, to make sure that there's funding, and to make sure that we really stretch our definitions of who counts as an educator, who counts for providing support in the community, and really make sure that we keep an eye on the fact that STEM is both a guiding light during the pandemic and it is our future. Thank you.
Thank you. So our final speaker is Mackenzie Vargas, General Manager for Education at Thermo Fisher Scientific.
Thank you, James. And I'm going to be sharing my screen here. So let me get this pulled up. I just have really one slide to guide me through the discussion. And we've certainly heard quite a number of perspectives from educators to the science industry to K through 12, and my perspective is a little bit different, so hopefully will round us out. But being part of Thermo Fisher Scientific, the world leader in serving science, and very proud to be part of the company since we've been very involved with COVID testing, which many of you I'm sure have seen in the news. You know, my responsibility, part of it is the business unit of Fisher Science Education. We're fortunate enough to work with many, you know, on this call and their counterparts in supporting education, and we're a huge proponent of STEM. It's one of our key initiatives, And I'm going to be touching on 3 things, but kind of in the lens of that view. So really supporter in the industry. And one of the first things I'm going to touch on is, how have buying behaviors changed? And I think we're going to see continued themes that are similar. And really, it's the differences that are happening across the country, whether it's the geographical situation, the socioeconomic situation, and really just the environment in which that educational organization is operating. So, in terms of buying behaviors, things are really being impacted by a few things. It's what I just mentioned, kind of the disparate and reactionary approach, especially after, we all hit March and everyone really went home to some degree. That's really overshadowed by budget uncertainties, which were already, I'll use the words that were explained before, and how you mentioned this, the pre-existing conditions. Budget uncertainty was already there. So now we're taking limited funds to some degree, and again, very disparate across various parts of the company and organization and country, but we're forcing a small amount of funds into reallocations. And what we're seeing from our perspective is things that we're going to be going towards STEM and other investments in education and curriculum are going to things to keep the facility safe, such as PPE, such as cleaning items, and really enhancing the facilities. As Kirsten mentioned, square footage is being evaluated. So investments in structures and facilities are taking funds that historically were potentially allocated for STEM or curriculum and being changed. So kind of the takeaway here is, as an industry provider, how do we help that decision making to keep the integrity of STEM critical in the environment? And that's something that we all need to consider together. The second aspect that I'd like to reflect on is, as a provider in the industry, how have we changed in terms of reacting to the changing times with COVID? And also, but more importantly, not only where we are, but where do we think we're going? Because the school year ended in a very rapid fashion. It was very unique, and that was very reactive. We were trying to figure out, how do we support the students? How do we keep ourselves sane? How do we work from home? All of those things were being considered. And that's now somewhat behind us, but now how do we move forward? Because we're going to be in this situation. So the challenges, of course, were how do we translate a brick and mortar environment to a remote learning environment, knowing that technology is disparate, knowing that there's activity challenges, and how do we deliver curriculum? So that was the real crux of the issue, and will continue to be. But the future state, and from Fisher Science Education and Thermo Fisher as a whole, our hope is that we can leverage technology, and it might vary. It might be conference calls versus WebExes. It might be different and unique ways to engage, broadband or smartphones as an option where we have limitations. And Kevin mentioned this earlier, and I'm glad he did, but kitting is really a key aspect of how do we have a grab and go type situation for students where, in a historical classroom, biology, chemistry, or in elementary, you have a different setup. You're not going to have that physical space. You're not going to have a teacher managing through kind of the safety pieces. You need to have a different mechanism to be complementary to a different delivery of STEM education. So that's going to be very interesting. So really providing that value. And then kind of the last piece I'd like to reflect on is more in the higher ed space and how universities are adapting to internships. So a little bit different, but still relevant. And a couple of figures to share. About 75% of employers had to modify their plans. I will share kind of anecdotally, Thermo Fisher actually canceled our intern programs for summer of 2020 because as a science-based company, many of our internships were in a lab or in a physical space, and that was really difficult to translate to virtual. So that's a problem. And 42% of those employers had to make virtual changes. So they were able to keep the program, but had to change it. I think the takeaway here is we're in a unique position where there's an opportunity for us. And I think at any level of education, whether it's K through 12 or higher ed, and there's a couple success stories that I've shared here, one from Brown, one from Case Western, it's an opportunity where there's been an aggregation of how do we have a matchmaking piece for intern programs that have gone virtual. And I think some types of programs will continue to expand, but I think it goes beyond actual program implementation. It's competencies and skill sets that are going to be more relevant in a virtual world. Whether we go back to some physical activities is obviously going to happen in some capacity, but how do we remain relevant? How do I teach students at any level how to engage virtually, whether it's through technology tools, but those competencies that will translate not only in an educational environment, but post-education in their career, and how do they continue to engage? So I want to thank James, thank you for allowing me to participate in the session and take any questions.
So first off, thanks to all of our speakers. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and those of you who are attending, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We will answer those. But I'm going to start off with a question. I'll direct it at Kevin and Renee. So Congress is debating legislation that will involve how schools are funded with federal dollars to get through this coming school year and to deal with the questions involving education in the fall. So if you were omnipotent in your district and you got a pot of federal funds, how would you prioritize those funds around the STEM topics in particular? So Kevin, let me first turn to you.
Sure, thank you. So, of course, that's going to depend on the particular district. Our rural districts versus our suburban or urban districts have different needs, some of those pre-existing conditions that were referenced previously. I think the key thing is flexibility. So there aren't a lot of districts being able to access good virtual learning opportunities. And so supporting teachers using funds to support teachers in professional learning around those, and purchasing materials that are effective for that would be two places that I could see as being really important, as well as, like Mackenzie brought up this kitting idea, we're using kits. So getting some hands-on materials into the hands of students if they can't be physically in the school for safety reasons, as another thing that I would love seeing those resources going toward.
Renee?
So I'm going to agree with that. Professional learning and somehow giving schools the time and space to be innovative with their schedules so teachers have more time to plan. I would like to give materials to the kids so that they can do the activities that the investigations, the observations that they need to make, the building and designing that we want them to do, have the materials so that they could actually manipulate that themselves individually, and platforms so that students can engage in science and STEM in a virtual space, specifically for elementary, because that funding seems to go a lot to middle school and high school, or it already exists, but it doesn't always exist for our young friends, and they are super capable of doing it if it is appropriate platform for them. And so that's where my funding would go.
Excellent, excellent. So let me give our other three panelists a chance to jump in if they want to, in terms of how you would prioritize federal funding to aid in STEM education going forward. Anybody want to jump in?
I'll just add an additional, it could be that depending on whether you're doing a blended and trying to do some in-person, that there's actually going to need to be some money for staffing, because you might need to get creative about how you're doing staffing, the ratio of kids to teachers in order to be able to have the space that you need. And so you just want to be able to support educators to have the right kind of balance of the safety measures and their time for planning and things like that. So I really think some creative staffing and funding to help make sure that can happen.
Anyone else? Mackenzie, Kirsten?
I'd certainly echo what Kevin said about making sure that the funding doesn't have so many restrictions on it that it can't be used to meet the specific needs of a district. I'd also encourage funders to look at, follow the child. there are going to be so many other support areas. So where that funding is needed. And in some ways it's, in the same way in education in which we've looked at mastery as the way we earn our way forward in school, in some ways looking at that from a funding perspective to say that if you can deliver and support these needs in your community, you should be just as eligible as other organizations in being able to provide that and receiving the funding for that. So again, getting back to that boundary spanner language, I think we're going to find that there's a different range of organizations who can support children and families in each community and even variation within that community. And they're not going to be able to do that if there's not some broader definition put into funding.
So Mackenzie, would you like to get in on this?
I'll just close it out. I think everyone has covered most of the topics. I think maybe one thing to add from my perspective, I think it's important, kind of as Kirsten and both Kevin mentioned, we need to have flexibility within the funding, but I also think the context of best practices as to application, because some schools that might struggle with how to actually use the funds might be benefiting from guidance on where those funds have been used successfully as this comes into practice. So just some non-restrictive recommendations.
So we've got a question from the audience. So the question is, what congressional action can be taken to mitigate broadband and internet accessibility issues for students? So who'd like to take that on? And Kevin, you talked about broadband in your remarks, so why don't we start with you?
I wouldn't say policy in this realm is an area of expertise for me, but I mean, the government did have a role in getting telephone service once upon a time to every household in America. So getting broadband and or effective cell service to every home as well, I think is certainly in the realm of federal government funding to make that happen for all households.
I will just add, there is already attention to it congressionally, though I don't remember what committee is focusing on it. I don't know that it's the Education Committee, but some of the statistics I cited was actually from a GAO report to the group in Congress that's trying to improve the broadband situation. So maybe it's accelerate it and understand that it has consequences for how school is happening now. It's going to undermine some of our goals for education if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, one of the variables is, is this the FCC that leads this effort, or does Congress need to give additional authority or funding to support this effort? I mean, one of the themes that underlies every conversation about this is you have to have access online to enable all of the other technologies, right? It's laptops are useless without access to the internet. All the other interventions, that's, if you don't have water, you can't do much, right? And this is the water of education now. So we just had another question. Let me pull it up. Heidi, we did have a question, and please post this in the comments. A link to the URL for your report, please. And actually, could you just spend a moment talking about how people can get it? Because it's not always easy to get NAS stuff.
Yeah, why don't I? The whole report is available online, and I think that Kimberly's question might have been about the GAO report, which actually then that reference is listed in our report. So I will try to find the GAO report link, but first I'm gonna go get the link to our new Reopening Schools report and put that in the chat. So let me do that.
Okay, great. So let me ask another question that's sort of relating to the funding and the process of where we go from here. Can you talk about could somebody do a compare and contrast between how do the needs shift as you go from virtual learning to a hybrid model to an in-school model over time? And how much thought have you put into the different material needs and the funding streams available? And, can you say something about, for example, professional learning and the changes that would occur during those different phases? Who can jump in on that one? I saw you nodding, Kevin, but I don't want to go to you first on every question, so I'm going to go to Renee.
So I'll speak to what we're doing with professional learning. And so we have some asks that we think about, like, what is the student work? What student work are you expecting to see? What do you want to happen at the end? How are you going to go about doing that when you have your big questions that you want to approach in your activities? What tools will be best served as you use those? And also thinking about what could be done in person when we're in person, and then what could be done online. And so our goal is, we have a trajectory of learning for professional learning, and it will be synchronous and asynchronous virtually. And we're starting off with, these are some online tools you can do. So the biggest thing that we learned was, we can't give teachers too much and assume that they know how to use them all. And so with those questions and the things that they're thinking about as they teach, what are the tools that they need that are the basic tools that will help the teachers interact with the students, and using our new learning management system at the same time. So that's a big chunk. And then through that, we have a progression of learning to having more intense tools, starting off with the tools we have for our district, and then some of the other tools that they can get online. But really focusing on how do we have that, and then what does that relate to engagement? So when you want kids to communicate and you want to do a think, pair, share, well, you can't do a think, pair, share even in the classroom, but you can break students out into breakout rooms when they are in Zoom. And so how do we use the tools and the things and the approaches that we do already every day, but how can we do that in a virtual space? And then improving upon those approaches throughout the year. So we know we're not going to be like September, August, we're not going to be at 100%. We're not going to be at, we have this down. We know that this is going to be a process, and it's going to take time for us to improve, and we have a plan for that.
So Kirsten, I saw you had a comment. Would you like to add?
So following on this question, I'd say the other critical issue as you move between virtual, hybrid, in person is that the ability and competency and experience of a child and the family and the resources that they have are going to vary as that child moves across environments. So if you are following the child this year, you may see extreme ups and downs because their safe place, their place of great competency may, for example, be in virtual learning. And when they are moved into the hybrid or in person, all of a sudden they suffer again, right? Or vice versa, right? So they do best in that in-person environment and then they suffer in the virtual. I think what will be the greatest complexity is to make sure that as we shift, because we have the capacity to, because there are ups and downs in the pandemic, that we do not harm the child that's doing well in any one particular learning experience. And that is going to be a huge challenge for a district where they're trying to balance that equity in a highly constrained situation.
Others, thank you. Kevin, did you have something you wanted to add?
Two quick thoughts. One, I know we're going to see shifts from learning about instructional delivery to learning about how to keep kids safe when they're there in person. That's going to just have to be necessary and something that's ongoing. And two, equity has to underlie it all, because we certainly see different districts with different population of students being able to provide different levels of service to those students. And that's been an ongoing equity issue, and it's going to continue to be an equity issue, whether it's virtual, hybrid, or in-person learning, and that needs careful consideration.
Excellent. So that's as good of a last line as I could think of. We've got a moment for just any last comments from Mackenzie or Heidi. All right, well, at this point, I'm going to thank everyone. Thanks for our attendees. Thanks to everybody who could spend their time being a presenter today. I appreciate you all. And we will send around the recording of this event to everybody that joined, along with the list of the resources that are in the chat. Thank you all, and see you again next time.